Hello, students. In our early lecture, we have discussed two methods of communication, namely oral communication and written communication. Oral communication is the spoken words, written communication, words that are written in the form of writing. Next type of method that we are going to discuss here in this video lecture is face-to-face communication. What does it mean by face-to-face communication? This is if we thought, oh, we have used so many times this face-to-face communication in our daily routine communication. It is much more face-to-face communication rather than any oral or written communication. But this face-to-face communication, if we think, is more useful to the communication process. How? In what sense? Because face-to-face communication involves the variety of communication methods. Like face-to-face communication is oral communication too, and face-to-face communication also involves our non-verbal means of communication. If we have gone through the earlier video lecture about the methods of communication and oral communication, we have seen the chart, and in the chart I had already told you that our 35% communication takes place with the words of with the use of words, means it's a verbal communication. But our 65%, more than 65% communication takes place with the help of our non-verbal means of communication. And face-to-face communication involves both oral communication and non-verbal communication. That is what face-to-face communication is more useful, and that is what, as a student, you must learn that our classroom teaching is more useful in understanding. Practical teaching in the classroom is more useful because face-to-face communication is more useful, because you can see the teacher, you can see his hands are moving, his facial expressions, his use of blackboard, at the same time his oral lectures. And that is what the actual practical teaching in the classroom is more useful rather than online teaching. And that is what you must learn, that face-to-face communication is more useful, and that is what it has its importance, it has its significance. So what does it mean by face-to-face communication? The definition of the face-to-face communication is: face-to-face communication may be defined as communication when the communicator transmits his message in person to the receiver, in person, verbally, or even non-verbally. So it involves both verbal and non-verbal communication, and that is what it has its significance. Now, what are the characteristics of this face-to-face communication? Face-to-face communication is not necessarily oral or verbal. Therefore, we must remember that all oral communication need not be face-to-face. When a manager picks up the telephone receiver and instructs his subordinate, he communicates orally, but not in the face-to-face communication, because both are not in front of each other, but they are distinct. They are at different places. Similarly, radio broadcast is also maybe a live telecast, but it's a public address system. Such a public address system is also in college campuses, railway stations, oral and verbal communication, but certainly these are not face to face communications. So, where does this face to face communication? So, oral communication is not a face to face communication. Another point that we should note that face to face communication is all about non-verbal. It's not all about non-verbal. Means there should be a person in presence on the spot through his gestures, facial expressions, body language, mannerisms, dressing, way of walking, and even silence. Such a non-verbal means of communication are to be used, needs to be used, and that is what we have seen, that this face-to-face communication is non-verbal, but it is not non-verbal too. It's a combination of both, and that is what the physical presence of both the sender and the message receiver of the communication are very much required. Often the face-to-face communication is supplemented through the variety of facial expressions, variety of gestures, and body language. You cannot see such a through telephone, through radio broadcast, but you can see in the classroom lecture, in the cinematic films. At the same time, you can see the speaker, public speaker, who is addressing the audience. So he tries, if he's speaking in front of the speaker but he is beyond the dais, it makes him difficult to communicate with the audience. So it is much more useful that he should stand apart, and then he gets communicated. Okay, so this face-to-face communication that we need, and what are the examples that we see this face-to-face communication that we see in the form of interviews, in the form of meetings, conferences, classroom lectures, seminars, workshops, training programs, stage acting, and public address systems. Okay, so like this, these are so-called say the nature and the type of the things that we see here. Okay, at the same time, when we discuss about the face-to-face communication, we must learn that what are the advantages that we see. It's of course, face-to-face communication is effective because it is accompanied by non-verbal means of communication, which is 65% of our communication. It is clearly understood. If it is not listened carefully, the use of body language makes him to get understood what the message is there. So listener tries to decode the message encoded by the sender. At the same time, there it's face-to-face communication, so the listener can just express through his facial expression. The teacher knows who is the student, who is in a doubt, who has a problem. So teacher immediately tries to notice that, because facial expressions communicate. It's a feedback from the student. So there is an instant feedback. This is one of the advantage of this communication. Then it is very much useful in delicate situations. If the situation like a strike, like rivalries, like tensions in the family, such delicate situations can be handled or tackled by face-to-face communication. This is one of the advantage. At the same time, if secret matters needs to be communicated, confidential matters are to be confided to the person trustfully, so we can have such a sharing in the confidential matters. So we have confidential matters that we see. It's useful for interviews. Of course, face-to-face communication makes the interviewer to understand the candidate in full details, general interviews and public figures. So we can offer a good job to a rightful candidate. So like this is useful for interviews. Its impact of the speaker's personality. Of course, face-to-face communication makes this as one of the better way to impress the audience. He presents his thoughts, he presents his views with his body language and leaves a great impression on the receiver's mind. See, the effective communication that we needs to be communicated, it's effective because it has a very better understanding of the message receiver, and that is what it is very much useful. If we see what are the disadvantages, if it is used in large audience, then it becomes very difficult. If thousands and lakhs of people are in front of the stage and the speaker is communicating, so he will not appear because in the large gathering we don't have a retention capacity of the listener, so the teacher or the public speaker will find it difficult to get his message across to each and every person in the masses. So it is difficult in large audiences, but there may be some kind of recuperative measures that we can take. Suppose if the larger screen and loud speakers are used and arranged in multiple places so that he is audible to each and every person, and if the video camera and larger screen is displayed, so we can have a very good achievement in this message say communication. So it is not useful in large audiences. At the same time, it is also not useful in large organizations because large organizations are of course from different places, different countries, so we cannot have a good communication at this say platform. At the same time, it is not useful for lengthy communication too, because the listener's attention cannot be stretched to a longer duration. ऐकणाऱ्याचं जी मानसिकता आहे ती जास्त काळ आपल्या स्ट्रेच करून लांबून ठेवता येत नाही. त्याचं मन भटकू शकतं, त्याचे काही लिमिटेशन्स येतात, सायकोलॉजिकल असतात, आणि म्हणून आपल्या लक्षात आलं असेल का आपले लेक्चर्सचं ड्युरेशन हे 40-45 मिनटापर्यंत ठेवलेलं आहे. कारण एकच 4-5 तासामध्ये एक लेक्चर चाललं असतं तर 6 दिवस 6 विषय आपण शिकले असते, पण तसं नाही आहे. आणि म्हणून एकाच विषयावर आपण जास्त वेळ ऐकू शकत नाही. ही मानसिकता विचारात घेऊन आपल्याला क्लासरूममध्ये, कॉलेजमध्ये किंवा स्कूल्समध्ये लेक्चर हे छोट्या छोट्या कालावधीचे असतात, ज्यामध्ये आपल्याला शिकवलं जातं. त्याचबरोबर पुअर रिटेन्शन हा एक प्रॉपर डिसएडव्हान्टेज आहे. जर लेखक जेव्हा बोलणारा व्यक्ती आहे, दिस मेसेज सेंडर अँड द रिसिवर, if the receiver is receiving so many words continuously, he cannot process it quickly in his mind. So it results in a poor retention by the listener. So that makes it as one of the difficulty in this particular method of communication. So it is useful that we should work on the disadvantages to multiply its uses, and that is what we have to use this. It's very difficult to practice to bring everyone in the message, say in the message delivery. Of course it is very difficult to practice but we can work on that. We can use a very good use of when it is needed. We have to come to the proper understanding, then we have to use this in when it is the difficulty in the gathering, at the same time it is ineffective. So we can use this communication to make it more effective, and so that we can have a very good understanding of the things. So like this we have this particular type of method of communication, that is face to face communication. In our next lecture we will move on and we'll study the next non-verbal type of communication. Till then, thank you. Goodbye.